That's as good as it's gonna get.
Because of the light behind.
Yeah, that's as good as that's gonna get.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, ladies and gentlemen? Good evening. If everyone can have a seat, we're about to begin. Thank you. My name is Sharon Wigwall. I'm a member of the Charleston Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, serving as your hostess this evening. Welcome to the City Gallery and welcome to Moja Arts Festival Poetry and Storytelling Series. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing Damon Fordham, who I just discovered is a Kamya, but he was raised here. He's a walking historian, he is a musician, he is an educator, and he is a storyteller. You can participate in his tours by going online to Buxton and Books and signing up for his tours. And I have friends that have taken his tours. I haven't had the opportunity, and they loved his tours. This evening, after the performance, we have 3 books available over to my right and to your left. And they are True Stories of Black South Carolina, Voices of Black South Carolina, Legends and Legacy, and Mr. Potts and Me. And without further ado, I'd like to present Damon Fordham.
How's everybody doing? Yeah. I don't hear you. How's everybody doing? Okay. Now that's more like it. Give yourselves a hand, folks. Thank you. All right, now I'm going to start off by giving you the root of the matter. A story that is seldom told, but is necessary in order to put all of this stuff in context. You see, back in 1443, there was Prince Henry the Navigator over in Portugal. And he made a deal with the kings and chiefs down in Angola, West Africa, to get some of their war captives. Now, often when I bring this subject up, you have those who get up there and go, well, how can they sell their own people as slaves? Well, the truth is it wasn't that simple. You see, Africans, like any other groups of people, did not see themselves as one homogeneous group of people. They saw themselves as different tribes and ethnicities and nationalities, just as the Europeans or Asians or anybody else did. So throughout human history, whenever you went to war with people and they lost, they were enslaved. The British were slaves to the Romans during the Roman Empire. In fact, the English word slave comes from the Slavic people of Central Europe who were enslaved by the Vikings during the 1000s AD. So that process worked out, and then around 1500, the Portuguese began taking these folks to Brazil to help clear out the land and help colonize them and everything. And then in 1503, Christopher Columbus, on his 3rd voyage to the Dominican Republic, brought along with him a Spanish priest by the name of Father Bartolomé de Casas. And Padre Bartolomé, well, that was his name. Well, Padre Bartolomé de Casas was horrified at Columbus's enslavement of the Native American Indians of the Caribbean. And he said, Mon Dios, this is a shame what Columbus is doing to these people. This must cease and desist. So he came up with a solution. Go to Africa and get the blacks instead. And so that led to this transcontinental slave trade. And then on August the 20th, 1619, Jamestown, Virginia, on a ship called a Man of War, that brought in 20 Africans to Jamestown, bringing in the colonial American version of this trade. And at the same time that happened, you had these people called the white indentured servants. The poor whites of Western Europe who would exchange 7 years of slavery for having a nonviolent prison offense or something like that, or to reduce their debts. But the colonial government of Virginia had a problem. These poor indentured whites and these enslaved blacks were getting along way too well. And they began to copulate and reproduce. And the colonial government of Virginia said, whoa, hold up. What if these folks get wise and realize that we are using them both for their cheap labor? They might come together and revolt. So in 1676, you had a fellow by the name of Nathaniel Bacon who tried to start Bacon's Rebellion and would have done just that. But he died of dysentery before that could go through. To which the colonial government of Virginia went, whew, that was close. Needless to say, they weren't exactly drowning in tears and mourning over this. So they said, we can't let this happen again. So therefore, they phased out white indentured servitude and increased black slavery and saw to it that the blacks remained in a permanently enslaved fashion and with more and more restrictions. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. Sound familiar? Yes. And that was the root of the problem. So then in 1670, Captain Nathaniel Sale of England, by way of Barbados, came here on a ship called the Three Brothers, along with his father, a British royal lord governor, 3 European servants, and 3 African slaves were given the English names John, John Jr., and Elizabeth. And that is how it came to Charleston. Now, there are a number of really fascinating stories that surround this map. And I will start with a place not very far from here called the City Market. First of all, folks, contrary to popular belief, the City Market that you see on Market Street, listen very carefully because you might hear otherwise from people who don't know any better, that was not the slave market. The real slave markets were on number 6 Chalmers Street and on the corner of Broad and East Bay. Got it? Yes. But I'll tell you what did happen on Market Street in those days. You see a fellow by the name of Charles Coatsworth Pinckney built it to the city in 1798. And it was used as a farmer's market. And people came there to buy and sell their wares. And then there came this wonderful art form called the Singing Street Salesman of Charleston. Those of you who are familiar with Porgy and Bess might remember this. Here come the honey man, here come the honey man. And while on the subject of Porgy and Bess, you would have a gentleman selling the porgy fish, which was a little black fish that was the namesake of the more famous character. And to sell the porgy fish, he would go, porgy, porgy, what porgy, talk porgy, with a knife and fork, porgy, in order to sell the fish. Yes. And then you had a child selling the Charleston News and Courier newspaper. And he would go, look out your window, peep out your duck, come on and get your news and courier. And then you would have a gentleman selling brooms going, drinking, gambling, sleeping on the floor, that's what keeps them, and so forth, etc. and so forth. Now, in the late 1900s and early 2000s, there were 2 outstanding Singing Street salesmen. One whose name will bring a smile to any Charlestonian above the age of 35. Here I'm talking about the son of a Russian Jewish immigrant by the name of Samuel Sonny Goldberg. When back during the Depression, J.L. Goldberg had the furniture store on 445 King Street, and he would send Sonny to sing to advertise to bring the people into the store. Sonny had the loudest, most annoying, atonal, accent-laden voice known to man. But yet, in spite of his outrageously bad singing, he could bring in the crowds. And by the time I was a boy, Sonny was on television singing the same song that he did back to attract crowds many years earlier, going, they call me the old King Street singer, cause I sing whenever I'm blue. And if you should be feeling lonely, then I'd recommend it to you. You may not be Mary Olanza, not fishing or coming or being, but you feel so good in the morning when you open your mouth and sing. And he continued to do that until he died. In 1997 at the age of 75, and there's a marker in front of the furniture store to commemorate his contributions to Charleston culture. And the last of the great singing street salesmen was Anthony Wright, AKA Tony the Peanut Man. His sisters Cheryl and Jackie sang in the choir with me at Wando High School back in 1979. And he had this secret recipe of boiling peanuts that he would sell in the city market and at the Charleston River Dogs baseball games. And his claim to fame was, hey, 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 now what I say, hey, got some boiled, got some roasted, got some fried, I got some toasted, oh yeah, peanut man, catch what can, got some hot, I got some cold, got some deep down to the soul, oh yeah, peanut man, catch what can, you got the right one, baby, and he continued to do that until he died of multiple sclerosis. At the age of 63 in November 2016, and is one of the last of the great singing street salesmen of Charleston. But thanks to my memory, you have just experienced the lost art of great singing street salesmen. Oh, I'm not done yet. Now, not too far from the city market, there was once a place called the Sugar House. During the days of slavery, in the 1700s, the Sugar House was used as a sugar refinery on the corner of Logan and Magazine Streets. And in 1775, it converted into a slave dungeon. And it was basically where they would send runaways and rebels and people such as that. One such person was James Matthews of St. George, South Carolina. He was enslaved to Davy Cohen in that area. And he ran away and hid out in the Four-Hole Swamp area, Dorchester County. And they caught him and sent him over to the Sugar House. And at the Sugar House, they had glass glued to the walls to prevent them from climbing out to escape. And they were also beaten with cat-of-nine tails. He would go on to say that while he was a religious man, he had no fear of hell because he'd already been to the Sugar House. All right, come on. So he somehow managed to escape, and he stowed away on a ship to Boston, where he became a free man, and he learned to read and write, and he wrote his autobiography in 1838, which is the source of that information. And another great story about the Sugar House comes to us from Janie Mitchell. Janie Mitchell was born in slavery in 1862 in Charleston, and when she was a little girl, they signed the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, which has been in the news quite a bit over the last few days, wink, wink. And so she grew up in freedom, and she would go on to work for a wealthy family on Calhoun Street. And in her spare time, she would write stories about her past in a composition book before she died in 1931. And about several years ago, the great-granddaughters of the people who she worked for published the composition book as Janie Mitchell, Reliable Cook from Evening Press Books. And one story that she told was about the Sugar House. She said that there was a guy whose master sent him to the Sugar House with a note. And the fellow told, and the master told the enslaved person, okay, here's what you do. Go down to the Sugar House and give the man this note, and he'll give you X amount of sugar to bring back. Yes, sir. So he went to the Sugar House, and on his way, he's like, hold up, wait. Anybody with common sense knows they stopped selling sugar at the Sugar House years ago. Does this guy think I'm parking on Dumb Street or something? I mean, whoa, this isn't right. But, you know, being enslaved, he couldn't read. So he looked down the street. excuse me, sir, can you come here for a minute? Yes, what can I do for you? Mister, can you please read this note for me? Yeah, sure, let's see. Dear sir, to whom it may concern, please give this enclosed Negro 50 lashes, and the guy all of a sudden took off like that, never to be seen in Charleston again. But needless to say, he didn't get whipped. And the moral of that story, folks, is just you might be illiterate, doesn't tell you ignorant. Y'all know that as Summertime from Porgy and Bess. And most of you associate that with the great jazzman George Gershwin. Gershwin wrote the music to that, but the lyrics and the story came from Du Bois Hayward, who in turn got it from the story of a real-life African-American disabled beggar in Charleston who was born in James Island named Samuel Smalls. Samuel Smalls was born in 1889 with what his father called little images of feet. In other words, he had polio. And so the father built him a goat cart, and they moved to Charleston sometime in the early 1900s. And in order to make somewhat of ends meet, Samuel would go around his goat cart selling vegetables and ginger cakes, and to attract people to buy his goods, he would go, "Give me that old-time religion, give me that old-time religion, give me that old-time religion, that's good enough for me," and so forth. So he would occasionally go to a place called Cabbage Row, that's commonly known to you as Catfish Row, where he would water Nan the goat, and then hang out with the fellas and drink liquor and shoot dice and try to talk with the ladies. And on the night of March the 22nd, 1924, he went down to number 4 Romney Street uptown, where he met a young lady by the name of Maggie Barnes. And the two of them got into an argument where he accused her of stealing his watch. So he pulled out his pistol and pow, 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 pow. And being that he had polio and couldn't move around, he couldn't aim very well. So needless to say, she survived the shooting. And he was locked up on $300 bond and sent over to the Old City Jail on Magazine Street. And the very next morning, March the 24th, 1924, the Charleston News and Courier had a headline saying, "Cripple accused of firing at woman." Hey folks, this was 1924. There was no such thing as political correctness or cultural sensitivity, all right? So Du Bois Hayward was in his apartment on Church Street with his sister, eating his breakfast and reading the paper. And he went, "Hey, I know this guy." And he thought of the tragedy of Samuel Small's life, being born poor, black, disabled, illiterate, reduced to street begging to survive in his pathetic attempts to find love. And he thought of all, he had a "there but for the grace of God go I" moment. And he wrote a novel based on Samuel Smalls called Porgy, which, by the way, is a very good book. I have it at home. Makes excellent bedside reading. So George Gershwin read the book, and George Gershwin was so moved by what he read that he came down here to collaborate with Du Bois Hayward on what we know today as Porgy and Bess. And it went on Broadway in 1935 to great success. George Gershwin died in 1937, and Du Bois Hayward died in 1940. Samuel Smalls stayed at the Old City Jail on Magazine Street until June the 3rd, 1924. The air was pretty bad around here, and he already had polio to begin with. So his lungs were congested, and Judge S.C. Brown suspended his sentence, and two of his cousins came up to where he was seated in the court, lifted him up by under his arms and carried him downstairs and into the goat cart. And Nan the goat took him to the ferry, and the ferry took him home to James Island, where he lived with his mother for the last 3 months of his life, never knowing of this thing called Porgy and Bess. And Maggie Barnes outlived all of them well into the 1970s. In 1970, the Charleston News and Courier tried to interview her about being the real Bess. But by then, she was married to a decent man and involved with her church. And she didn't want either one to know about that part of her past. So she went to her grave without willingly being acknowledged as the real Bess. And about 12 years ago, I went to a forum where the family of the real Samuel Smalls was present. And his nephew, J.C. Delliston, came up and said something that sums up the whole story of Porgy and Bess, which said, if a man riding a goat cart can inspire something that has given the world so much joy, then what can we do? Now, another place that's not too far from us is the Dock Street Theater, which was built in 1736, the oldest continuing theater in the United States. Back in the 1950s, it was run by a man named Emmett Edward Robinson, who was married to Patricia Colbert Robinson, who was the aunt of the most famous Charlestonian, the comedian Stephen Colbert. And in 1959, he held a performance of Romeo and Juliet. And at the same time in 1959, there was and is Burke High School, which was and is the predominantly black high school here in Charleston. And there was a precocious young girl by the name of Barbara Gathers, who was a student there at the time. And she knew, she wanted to see Romeo and Juliet, but she knew that this was 1959. And she was not about to go to the Dock Street Theater and say, excuse me, I'd like a ticket, because you know what happened back then. So she wrote Emmett Edward Robinson a letter and asked if there was any way he could send the players to Burke High so that they could enjoy Romeo and Juliet. Emmett Edward Robinson did one better than that. He secretly had the students slip through late one night to enjoy, in the under cover of darkness, a dress rehearsal of Romeo and Juliet. And Barbara Gathers went on to run the first black bookstore in Charleston, the Unique Ideas Bookstore. And when I was a teenager, that place was my favorite haunt. And one day I walked in there and I told her, Miss Gathers, one day my books are going to be in your bookstore. And she got a big kick out of that. Now, by the time my books came out, the bookstore was closed. But she followed me when I was involved with radio and newspapers and such. And 2 years ago, she wrote her autobiography. And I went to the book signing. And at the book signing, she told both of the stories that I just told you. And then at the end of the book signing, there was a middle-aged lady who walked up to her and said, Miss Gathers, that story about Emmett Edward Robinson really inspired me. And Miss Gathers said, why? And the lady replied, Emmett was my dad. Most of you know that I just played Michael Row the Boat Ashore and Come By Here, Lord, Come By Here. But what most people don't know is that those are actually old Gullah songs. Those songs were first given to the American public back in 1867 when a book was published called Slave Songs of the United States that recorded the songs of this area in book form. And when you speak of Gullah, you think of the ladies with who sold the baskets out in the market. You think of the rice cuisine culture, and you think of the local dialect. Well, here's the origin of all of that. You see, all of this comes from the Gola people of Sierra Leone and Liberia in West Africa, who, along with the Mendes and the Kises, were the ancestors of much of Charleston's black population today. And in Sierra Leone and Liberia, they would make these baskets to sift and store rice, which was a major part of their diet over there. And there was a British slave dealer in the 1700s by the name of Richard Oswald, who would have these folks in pens and barracoons on Bance Island off the coast of Liberia and Sierra Leone. And he, in turn, would sell these people to his business partner, a man from Monk's Corner named Henry Lawrence, who, in turn, would sell these people to rice plantation owners between the coasts of Georgetown, South Carolina, and St. Simon's Island, Georgia. And because these islands were so isolated, as was the case of the black people of Africatown and Mobile, Alabama, and in New Orleans, you had these folks kept more of their African culture, folkways, and dialect than any other black people brought to these United States. And that became known as the Gullah culture. Now, my grandmother, Janie Fordham, was born in 1905 in Awendaw, South Carolina. And she had to work in the fields as a girl, and she never learned how to read and write. So in 1968, when I was 4 years old, yeah, do the math, my grandmother would call me in the house by going, "Damon, y'all churn too trifling. Y'all better come on and y'all white books, y'all." And things like that. Now, she and my grandfather worked to send my dad to South Carolina State, which is South Carolina's major black college. And he was the first of 3 generations of teachers in our family. I was the second, and my nephew, Quadro Campbell, was the third. And in those days, if you were black and educated, you wanted nothing to do with Gullah. In those days, Gullah was seen as ignorant, backwards, and countrified, and a hindrance to upward mobility. But as you folks know very well, I always had a love for mimicry, even back then. So every now and then I would make my dad furious and go, "Daddy, I ain't hungry, I just want some okra soup." And he said, "Stop that! I didn't send you to school to talk like that. How I'm wrong, Daddy, I just want to eat. Stop it! Quit mugging around with us, stop it, I say!" Well, in 1932, there was Dr. Lorenzo Dow Turner, who was a black linguist from Vesey University in Nashville, Tennessee. He came down to South Carolina State in 1932 to teach languages. And he came across students from the Charleston area who were saying things such as, "Man, Dr. Turner, you hot up in here, man, up the window." Excuse me, man, Dr. Turner, hot up in here, up the window? Why, what type of speech is this? I find this rather fascinating. This is worthy of study. So for the next several years, he went throughout coastal South Carolina and Georgia, studying Gullah. And he came across a lady by the name of Amelia Dolly in Harris Neck, Georgia. And while they were speaking, she began to rock her chair and sing, "Awaka yilene, yile, 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 waka yilene." "Madam, what is that you are singing?" "Oh, my great-grandma been to sing that when I was a little gal." "Your great-grandmother sang this when you were a little girl?" "Madam, I must ask you this. Did your great-grandmother come directly off the boat from Africa?" "Yeah, how you didn't know that?" "Why, Eureka! That is the funeral song of the Mende tribe of Sierra Leone. Why, this Gullah is not the ignorant, backwards country junk that everyone says it is. This is the cultural connection between the Negroes of Africa and those of America." And in 1949, he wrote a book about it called Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect that made that connection. But that book was mostly for academics, so the masses of general public never read it to begin with. So, in 1988, General Joseph Momo of Sierra Leone spoke at the Penn Center, which is 70 miles south of here. And he got up in front of the people and said, "I glad if I see you today." Translation, "I'm glad to see you today." And a lady in the audience said, "Great God, that man for talk like we." talk like me back to Sierra Leone. And the people on both sides were amazed at the similarities of languages, lifestyles, and culture that PBS went along with them and made a documentary that was fittingly entitled Family Across the Sea. And that's the story of Gullah. Now, we're going to switch course for a few minutes here. One of the books that I wrote was called Mr. Potts and Me, and here's the story behind that. Now, in the audience is a boyhood friend of mine named Duke Brown, Walter Brown III over there. And he might remember when we were kids, there was this old man named Walter Snipe, who many of y'all called son, and who in our family called him Papa. And Papa was like my unofficial grandfather. He raised my mother after her grandfather died. And he would have a tool shed over on King Street. Not King Street in Charleston, but King Street in Mount Pleasant, where the men would gather and tell stories. He also had, in the tool shed, had a bunch of books that I loved to read. So he was basically my unofficial grandfather. Then there was my dad, who taught at the Black High School for over 20 years, Lang High School, and he loved to tell stories. And that was something that I got from him. And when I visited my dad's grave back in 1991, on the 7th anniversary of his death, I thought it'd be a shame if those stories were to die with him. So I came up with this very slightly fictionalized story about this little kid who everybody thinks is weird because he likes to read. And he befriends this old man who, yes, that was and he befriends this old man who gets him through life through this wisdom and stories. So I fused together my dad and Papa into a fictional character called Mr. Potts. And that was how I preserved a lot of my dad's stories. The next few stories will be from that book. Now, in one case, I have Mr. Potts talking to the old men around the tool shed about slavery. And he talks about the time during slavery when the master walked up to his slave and said, "Well, boy, how do I look?" The guy goes, "Well, master, you sure look mighty." "Why, what do you mean mighty?" "Well, you look kind of noble." "Noble? What do you mean noble?" "Well, boss, you look just like a lion." "A lion? Well, that's nice, but hey, wait a minute. Where'd you ever see a lion?" "Well, I saw one over by the barn the other day." "Well, wait a minute. There was no lion over there. That was a jackass." "Well, boss, I was right. It sure looked just like him." And then he went on to tell about the slave fight. About how one day these two masters were betting over whose one could fight the other one. And so one day this guy who owned a fellow named Old John came over to John and says, "Well, boy, I got a deal for you." "Yeah, boss, what's that?" "I'm going to have you fight this fellow on this next plantation, and if I win, I get to have his plantation along with mine." "Oh, you do, huh? Well, wait a minute. Why don't you say we sweeten the pot on this?" "Sweeten the pot? What are you talking about?" "Well, now, if you can get something out of the deal, I should get something out of it too, right?" "Well, yes, that's correct, but what are you getting at here?" "Well, now, if you're going to own his plantation if I win, that means you're going to have more people who are enslaved by you, right?" "Well, and? So you can afford to get rid of me and my family then, right?" "Come on now, let's sweeten the pot here." "You know, John, I guess you're right. All right, if you win, you get to go free, and I get these two plantations. Deal." So the next day, everybody's gone out to see the fight. The master's there smoking his cigar, waiting for the fight to begin, and Old John's like, "Yes, sir, my family, we're gonna get me free right now." But all of a sudden, a huge shadow was cast upon the gathering when they heard a boom, 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 boom. And they looked up, and John went, "Oh boy." There he was, big Goliath. "Where is John? Where is John?" And the master's like, "We're done for it now." He says, "No, we're not. So John just looked over the situation. He walked over, and there was the master's wife, and he looked at the master's wife and went, "Pah!" right across the face. And Big Goliath saw this one, "Ah!" and ran after the business. So the master came by with a rope and a pistol. "John, you done it now. What you slapped my wife for?" "You won the fight, didn't you?" "Well, yeah, but what do you mean by slapping the wife? Look, you got the plantations, I got my freedom. But I don't get it. What you do that for? You better speak up now." Simple. If he knew that I was bad enough to slap a white lady, you know what I would have done to him. And then I had Mr. Fox telling my doppelganger in this thing a few fables on how to get through life. And one has my doppelganger Lucas coming home. "Boy, what's the matter with you? You had a rough day at school?" "Yeah, they beat me up. Oh, Gunther, he beat me up." "Gunther, huh? Well, that boy isn't too bright. What you let him beat you up for?" "I didn't let him, he just did." "Well, did you fight back?" "Well, yeah, but Gunther's bigger than me." "Okay, so what was this all about? Why was he fighting you?" "'Cause I can answer the question in class and he can't." "Oh, is that what it is, huh? Boy, come here, let me tell you something about that. You know why Gunther don't like you and likes to beat you up and all this stuff?" "Right, but right." Simple. You see, once upon a time there was this fox who was crawling throughout the woods, and all of a sudden he got his tail caught in a trap like that. And his tail was cut off. And so he said, "Dag, I done lost my tail." And he looks around and he sees all the other foxes frolicking and sashaying in the brooks. And he said, "Oh, no, now see, I can't deal with this. I got to stop this." So the fox gets up on the stump and he says, hey ye, brothers and sisters, foxes and foxettes. I say you walk around all day with the hot bushy tails making you hot and dirty and sweaty, right? Especially on a hot summer's day." And the fool foxes listen to this and say, "Yeah, he's right, absolutely right. Yeah, amen, hallelujah. That's right." So you see, here's what you do to get rid of all that dirt, all that filth, and all that heat on a hot summer's day. I say you go over there down to the farmer's barn. I say you get yourself a good hard axe, and you do just like me. You see, you cut your tail off so you can be free of all that dust and dirt and heat. So come on, my brother foxes, be free of all that dust, heat, and dirt, and get yourself an axe and chop your tail off and be just like me. And the ignorant foxes went, "Yeah, amen, hallelujah, yeah, let's go get him." And the wise old fox got him and said, "Hold it, wait. Stop right there. Don't listen to this fool. Do you know what's going on here? See, he got his tail cut off in a trap. And he sees you all happy and frolicking with your tails in the water. And what he's trying to do is to get you to do that because misery loves company. And see, Lucas, this is why these bullies like Gunther can't stand you, because see, Gunther's not too bright. That boy is dumb. I'll be just totally honest with you. And here you are, intelligent, you like to read and all of that. So since he can't beat you with his brain, he tries to beat you with his body. But see, here's what you gotta do. You gotta be strong, you gotta walk around with dignity, you gotta carry yourself with pride, and you gotta walk away from the Gunthers of the world. Because you see, always remember that if you're doing right and people don't like you and try to drag you down, remember it's for one reason and one reason only: misery loves company. So let's take this back to Charleston. One of the best stories of Charleston history is of the Denmark Vesey Rebellion. Denmark Vesey was born in slavery in St. Thomas Virgin Islands in 1767. And his master was Captain John Prayler. Captain John let Denmark free. Why did he do that? Denmark read about the Haitian Revolution, where Toussaint Louverture overthrew the island of Haiti from the French and liberated his people. He read the Bible frequently. He loved Exodus 21:16 that says, he that leadeth into captivity, he that stealeth a man and selleth him shall be put to death. Bet you never heard that in Sunday school. He also liked Revelation 13:10 that said, he that leadeth into captivity shall be led into captivity. By the way, that was Malcolm X's favorite verse. Wonder why. Well, anyway, they went to Charleston in 1793. And in those days, if you were enslaved in Charleston, the master could rent you out. And not only would the master get compensated, but so would the slave. So Vesey did this to where he was able to buy a lottery ticket on East Bay Street in 1800. And he won. So the master's there, you know, see, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Captain Vesey? Oh, hey, Denmark, what's going on? Hey, let me ask you something. How much am I worth? How much are you worth? Let's see. Last time I checked my ledger here, $600. Why? All right, here you go. I'm out of here. See ya. Hey, Denmark, bye. And that was that. Denmark became a lay preacher at the Hempstead AME Church over on Charleston's east side, roughly where Wilmot Fraser Elementary School was up until recent times. And he was also a carpenter on Bull Street. And all this time, he secretly plotted the Great Slave Rebellion of 1822. The idea was he would get the country slaves, and the plan was that they would go to the armory, which is where the federal courthouse is today, and steal guns at night. Then they would go over throughout Charleston, setting fires at night, and when the white men came to put out the fire, pow, 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 pow! Then they would go right out here to Charleston Harbor to hijack ships, and so they would sail to Haiti and be free. But he warned his followers, do not tell the house Negroes. And who are the house Negroes? These were the enslaved people who worked in the house and had it better. And therefore they felt a sense of affinity toward their masters. So it would be foolish to tell them. Well, on May the 25th, 1822, over at the old customs house on East Bay and Broad, William Paul, one of his followers, went down there and he saw a house Negro. His name was Peter Prelude, and he was owned by Captain John Prelude. And he said, hey, Peter, what's going on? Y'all saw Mr. Paul. How is your boss? Oh, I'm doing fine, Peter. Hey, Peter, you want to get down what Denmark Vesey's doing? Denmark Vesey, who that is? Oh, shh, not so loud, Peter. Here's the plot, see? Ooh-wee! You gonna do that? What, Peter, feet don't fail me now. Hey, Peter! Peter ran to a black slave owner. Yes, there were many of those in Charleston in those days, roughly about 1,000, named William Penseal. Mr. Penseal, Mr. Boss, what are we gonna do, sir? Why, Peter, I do believe that you must go expeditiously upon your enslaver and inform him of this foul deed, therefore, because otherwise his demise shall be on your conscience. Yes, sir. So he ran to his master, Captain John Prelude. Mr. Prelude, Mr. Boss, what are we going to do, sir? Why, Peter, I shall call out the militia expeditiously. And that's what he did. Vesey and 36 of his followers were tried in June of 1822 and hanged on July the 2nd, 1822. Peter was fat and happy. The state set him free and gave him a stipend for the rest of his life. He married, had several children, and bought 3 enslaved people for himself, selling a 10-year-old boy named George in 1847 for $325. Don't believe me? Read Larry Coben's book, Black Slave Owners. It tells you all about it. Okay. Gee, what a swell guy, I tell you. So there was an African-American minister by the name of Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne over on Trad Street, who had a school for free and enslaved black children. The city forced him to shut it down. Why? Because you see, after the Denmark Vesey Rebellion, since he got the idea of it from reading, they made it illegal for African Americans around here to read. So they shut down his school. But he went to Wilberforce, Ohio, where he formed Wilberforce University, which was the first African-American college formed and staffed by African-Americans. And meanwhile, over here on the east side, they burned down the Hempstead AME Church. And for the next 43 years, African-Americans were forbidden to have independent worship services unless a white person was present to prevent talk of revolution. So, as a result of this, about after the Confederate surrender on February the 18th, 1865, one of Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne's students, Reverend Richard Harvey King, came down here and gathered up what was left of the Hempstead AME congregation, and they brought some land on 110 Calhoun Street, which he named after the Hebrew word for God is with us, which is Emmanuel, and it was the mother of the new black churches here in Charleston. And that is how Mother Emanuel came into being. On April the 12th, 1962, excuse me, Martin Luther King spoke at Mother Emanuel. And he told the city of Charleston that if African Americans were to vote in large numbers, the government of the state would speak in new tunes. And he was correct about that. But he made another interesting appearance here 5 years later. He went over to the old county hall over on 1067 King Street. And in those days, that was sort of like our Apollo Theater. All of James Brown and Jackie Wilson and those type of events. And the Harlem Globetrotters would go there. My dad said he took me to see the Globetrotters there in '68, but I don't remember that. But in either case, Martin Luther King came there in 1967. And the fellow who invited him was a great man from Johns Island by the name of Esau Jenkins. Esau Jenkins, with a 4th grade education, started the C&O Credit Union in this area, as well as many other businesses. And he chastised the crowd that night, even though there were 3,000 strong. He said the place would be packed if James Brown was there, but some of y'all were scared to come out because Martin Luther King was there. And he was right. He stayed at the home of a lady by the name of Miss Septima Poinsett Clark, who survived the Charleston race ride of 1919 in her home over on Henrietta Street at the time. And she was later fired for being a member of the NAACP while teaching and sued for her right to get her back pay, which she won in 1981, 6 years prior to her death. I saw her in 1982 at the Goodwill Parade in Charleston, 5 years before her passing, and the African-American, she was on a queen's float with regalia draped in a robe, and the people were reverently touching the float and following it as it passed by. That was my one and only encounter with her. But she stayed at Martin Luther King stayed at her place when he was in town, and he asked her if she wanted to go with him, and she declined because she was tired. So when Dr. King got up on stage, he made this great, great speech. He got up and talked about the rioting that took place in Detroit a few weeks earlier, and he said basically that he will not preach a doctrine of black supremacy because I'm so tired of white supremacy. He said, I'm not going to preach about burn, baby, burn. I'm going to say build, baby, build. Organize, baby, organize. Learn, baby, learn so you can earn, baby, earn. And somebody has got to have some sense in this world. And shortly after he said that, I was talking with Herbert Fielding, the late, great mortician and politician here some years ago about this. And he was on stage with the young James Clyburn and Mr. Jenkins and Dr. King. And he said that after Dr. King said these words, there was a fellow up in the balcony, and he had a light bulb, a huge bulb. And everybody was kind of antsy to begin with because Dr. King had a lot of threats on his life. And all of a sudden, while Dr. King was speaking, they heard a pow! And everybody's like turning around, what's happening here? And there's a famous picture of that that's included in my book. And according to Mr. Fielding, Dr. King did not flinch. He kept his eye on the audience and never lost track of what he was saying. And afterwards, Mr. Fielding said, he told me he walked up to Dr. King and said, Martin, Did you hear that light bulb drop? What light bulb? Light bulb drop. We thought it was a gunshot. We thought you were killed, and the police took the guy away. Oh, really? They did? Wait, you didn't hear that? And he smiled and put his arm around Herbert Field and said, Herbert, try to understand something. I go through so many brushes with death that if I paid attention to that, I would never get what I need to get done, which is the emancipation of our people and bringing justice to this land. And Herbert Fielding told me that that was the thing about Martin Luther King that gave him the greatest impression, and that happened right here in our city on the afternoon of July the 30th, 1967. Now, out there, most people know the story about how Robert Smalls sailed his family into freedom aboard a Confederate ship called the Planter, right out here in Charleston Harbor. And there's a little memorial of him to commemorate that. But there's something else he did that a lot of people don't know. After slavery ended, after the South lost the war, you had 3 constitutional amendments that was designed to reform the South. There was the 13th Amendment, which was designed to end slavery, which was basically conceived by Lincoln because Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation only covered the rebel states. And there were states who still had slavery that were not rebelling. The 13th Amendment was originally designed to basically end slavery in those areas. Now, there was the 14th Amendment in 1868 that said that all those born on American soil, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, were now citizens. And there was the 15th Amendment in 1870 that said all men could vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, with all of this, you had in 1868, throughout the South, there were conventions to reform the laws of the South. Here in Charleston, they met at the federal courthouse, which was then known as the Charleston Clubhouse. 76 blacks and 48 whites. And among the things they passed was a new constitution that said that all men above 21 could vote, women had the right to divorce abusive husbands, there would be a system of state hospitals and mental institutions, and on January the 23rd, 1868, Robert Smalls passed a law saying that all children between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school for 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. That was the foundation of the public school system of South Carolina. I brought that up at a city council meeting of the Historical Commission, and now that is on a marker over by the federal courthouse today. Now, along with all of this, and along with this, South Carolina had a black lieutenant governor from 1870 to 1872 named Alonzo Jacob Ransier, and he was followed by Howard Gleaves, Richard Howard Gleaves, who was a Haitian American. Richard Howard Gleaves served under Franklin J. Moses, the first Jewish governor of South Carolina. Only time in American history that you had a Jewish governor and a black lieutenant governor of any state in America. And it was under those two that my alma mater, the University of South Carolina, was integrated from 1873 to 1877. So what happened? Well, in Pulaski, Tennessee, the resistance came in. The 6 Confederate veterans formed under Captain John C. Lester a new organization that was named after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. You get the idea, folks. That's how it started. And this led to massive warfare throughout the South. Shootouts, hangings, a lot of gunfights back and forth. Some right here in Charleston, too, as a matter of fact. So the federal government got tired of this, and they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise in 1877 that ended Reconstruction and put the South back in the hands of bigots. Here in South Carolina, you had Benjamin Ryan Tillman, who was born in Trenton, South Carolina in 1847. He was with the Sweetwater Sable Club, who massacred African Americans at Hamburg, South Carolina in 1876. And 10 years after that, he stood on the steps of City Hall, bragging about killing N-words on the steps of City Hall. He also lost an eye to gangrene and never wore a patch. In 1890, he ran for governor. And 201, the educated white people of South Carolina said, "Oh, come on now. Surely the people of South Carolina couldn't possibly be so ignorant to elect such a man." I'm going to leave that right there. And in 1895, he tried to throw out the Reconstruction Constitution and bring in the Segregation Constitution. But South Carolina still had 6 black representatives, among them Robert Smalls and Thomas Miller, the founder of South Carolina State University, and 2 white delegates, T.E. Dudley of Marlboro and J. Halston Reeves of Georgetown, joined the 6 black representatives to stop the Tillman Constitution. And they made great articulate speeches against this. Even Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee University, he chimed in on this and told Benjamin Tillman that if you think it is expensive to educate the Negro, imagine how expensive it will be to your state to keep them in a state of permanent ignorance. Will industry and good immigration and industry come to a state where ignorance is the law? I think not. What you sow, you shall reap. And in spite of those great words, they voted 154 to 8 against the segregation for the Tillman Constitution. And Robert Smalls got up and said, "Before I sign that rag of your Constitution, I will walk home to Beaufort." And South Carolina remained segregated for 70 years. Now, the point of all of this is that through those years, the state was poor to begin with, and others like it. They wasted what little money they had on separate and unequal conditions. And that's what kept these states in poverty and illiteracy. And while, of course, the civil rights movement and people like Miss Clark and Esau Jenkins and many of the ones mentioned today did what they could to take care of those conditions, we know today that the problems of race and politics are still with us. And I explained to young people that it's okay for them to be angry and all of that, but this anger must be put in constructive directions and means toward a solution. And I often try to teach them about leaders, such as the ones that we've talked about today, who did just that. So I often tell them to study the story of these leaders and combine that with their zeal and energy and use of technology so that our country will be a better country. Now, I'm going to conclude with one other story very briefly that will wrap all of this up. Now, around the time that the Jim Crow laws were starting, the great Booker T. Washington was going to speak in Jacksonville, Florida. And the teacher there thought about all the terrible things that were happening at the time and what could he do to encourage the people's spirits when Booker T. Washington spoke. So he was a poet along with a teacher. So all of a sudden, the words in this wonderful melody came to him, and they had the program with Booker T. Washington, and it was a great success. And the song that he composed became a favorite throughout the nation and is renowned by many today, and it went something like this. Thank you.
Damon for this great history lesson. If he had been my history teacher, I might have made an A in history. Thank you for the Charleston community for joining us this evening. Please join us on the 3rd for Horace Mungen and on the 4th for Carlos Johnson and the Speak Freely Foundation. Professor Fordham's books are on sale over to my right with Buxton Books. Yes. And if you need a Moja booklet, it's at the back. And thank you again for attending this.
And I'll be happy to sign them too.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember who your grandmother was?
Yes.
No.